What happens when Clint Eastwood stops at a little girl's art stand? A life-changing moment, a $100,000 surprise, and a story that will leave you speechless. Emma Sinclair, an 11-year-old girl with big, bright blue eyes, sat on the hospital bed, her tiny legs swinging over the edge. She clutched a worn-out stuffed sea turtle, a gift from her late father, as she watched Dr. Patel, the kind-eyed oncologist, kneel before her. His face was gentle, yet the words that followed carried a weight heavier than any child should bear. "Emma, the medicine is working," he said softly, adjusting his glasses. "But we need 2 more rounds of treatment to make sure your body keeps fighting. It's expensive, $100,000 expensive." Emma tilted her head slightly, her little fingers absent-mindedly running over the seams of her stuffed turtle. She didn't fully understand numbers that big, but she understood her mother's silence. Standing beside her, Grace Sinclair, a tired, overworked single mother, stared at the floor, gripping her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. Grace started, her voice cracking. "I don't know how we're going to do this." Emma's heart squeezed. She didn't like seeing her mom sad, especially not because of her. She reached out and gently tugged her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, I can paint more," she whispered, offering a hopeful smile. Grace's lips trembled as she bent down, cupping Emma's face between her hands. "Baby, you don't have to worry about this. Mommy will figure it out." But the look in her eyes told Emma otherwise. The drive home was eerily silent. Normally, Emma would hum to the radio, making up silly songs about the world outside the car window, but tonight, the weight of grown-up worries sat too heavy on her little shoulders. The streetlights flickered past, casting long shadows inside the car, and as they pulled into their small one-bedroom apartment, Emma heard it, her mother's muffled crying behind the closed bathroom door. Emma curled up under her blanket, her turtle tucked close to her chest, and squeezed her eyes shut. She hated feeling helpless. She hated that she was sick, and more than anything, she hated that her mother, who worked all day at a local diner, barely making ends meet, had to bear the weight of something so impossible. Then an idea struck her. She sat up in bed, her mind racing. She had always loved painting, ever since she was little, before the hospital visits, before the needles, before the scary words like chemo and remission. She had painted. She painted the ocean because it reminded her of her dad. She painted the sky because it stretched forever, endless and free. Maybe, just maybe, if she sold her paintings, she could help. She jumped out of bed, ran to her tiny desk in the corner of the room, and pulled out her box of paints. The smell of acrylic and paper filled the air as she dipped her brush into a swirl of blues and pinks, stroking the canvas with childlike determination. The next morning, she woke up early, her painting dry and ready to be sold. She tiptoed into the kitchen where Uncle Ray, her late father's brother, sat drinking coffee. "Uncle Ray," she said, climbing onto the stool next to him, "can you help me sell my paintings?" Ray Sinclair, a rugged but kind-hearted fisherman, put down his coffee and raised an eyebrow. "Well now, little Pearl, that's an interesting business idea. What's the plan?" Emma beamed, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "If I sell enough paintings, I can help Mommy pay for my medicine." For a moment, Ray didn't speak. He just looked at her, this tiny, brave girl with more fight in her than a whole fleet of sailors. Then he exhaled and ruffled her beanie-covered head. "All right, kiddo, let's build you an art stand." By sunset, Emma had a booth. It wasn't fancy, just a few wooden crates from Uncle Ray's boat, a fishing net draped across the front, and a hand-painted sign she made herself. The sign read in bright, uneven letters, "My name is Emma. I paint to help my mommy and fight my sickness." As she sat behind the little stand, her paintings displayed neatly, Emma felt a mix of excitement and nerves. People bustled past, chatting, laughing, completely unaware of the tiny girl sitting there, waiting for someone to notice. She hugged her turtle close and whispered to herself, "This is going to work. It has to." She was only 11, but she was ready to fight. And she had no idea that soon, one of the most famous men in the world would change her life forever. The next morning, as the golden rays of the sun peeked over the rooftops of Charleston, Emma Sinclair sat behind her tiny wooden art stand, her little feet swinging off the edge of her stool. She arranged her paintings carefully, brushing off invisible dust with her small hands, her bright blue eyes sparkling with quiet determination. Around her, the Charleston art market bustled with energy. Street musicians strummed lively jazz tunes, vendors shouted about their handmade crafts, and the salty ocean breeze carried the scent of fresh bread from a nearby bakery. But despite the crowd, no one stopped. Tourists strolled by, their sunglasses reflecting the morning light, but their eyes never landed on her tiny booth. A group of young women passed, giggling about where to grab brunch, one of them barely glancing at Emma's colorful paintings before wrinkling her nose and moving on. Emma bit her lip, gripping the hem of her pink dress, reminding herself that she just needed one person, just one, to believe in her work. The minutes turned into hours, and her heart began to sink. Her hands fidgeted with the frayed edges of her paint-stained beanie, her fingers tracing over the uneven stitching where her mother had mended it. A well-dressed woman in high heels finally paused, glancing at the handwritten sign Emma had carefully painted the night before. The woman tilted her head, reading the words aloud. "My name is Emma. I paint to help my mommy and fight my sickness." Emma held her breath, hopeful, but the woman simply sighed, her voice coated in polite sympathy. "Oh, sweetheart, that's so sad, but I'm afraid I don't have room for any more little paintings." She patted Emma's hand as if that would somehow help, then walked away. Emma's throat tightened, and she quickly blinked away the sting of tears threatening to spill. She didn't want pity. She wanted help. Then, just as she was about to lose hope, a shadow fell across her stand. She looked up to see an elderly fisherman with weathered hands and kind brown eyes kneeling to get a better look at her paintings. Mr. Jacobs, a longtime dock worker, studied the painting of a stormy sea, his fingers tracing the brushstrokes as if they carried the weight of old memories. His voice was low and gentle. "This one here reminds me of my wife. She always loved the ocean." His face softened as he reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn leather wallet and handing Emma a crisp $80 bill. Emma's small hands shook as she took it, her lips parting in disbelief. "Really? You like it?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He smiled, nodding. "You're a talented little thing. Keep painting, young lady." Emma could barely contain her joy. She had done it. She had made her first sale. She clutched the money to her chest, grinning so wide her face hurt. Maybe, just maybe, she could actually do this. Maybe people would see her, not just as a sick little girl, but as an artist. But the feeling didn't last long. A few moments later, a tall man in a perfectly tailored gray suit strode up to her stand, his polished shoes clicking against the pavement. Trevor Holloway, one of Charleston's most well-known art dealers, peered at Emma's work through gold-rimmed glasses, his expression unreadable. Emma's heart pounded. This was a real art dealer. If he liked her paintings, maybe she could sell even more. She sat up straighter, clutching her brush-stained fingers together, waiting for his words. Trevor exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "This is sweet, but let's be honest, little girl. Art is about pedigree, reputation. You don't just slap some paint on a canvas and call it valuable." He picked up one of her ocean scenes and studied it with cold disinterest, stick to coloring books. Then, just like that, he set the painting down and walked away. Emma sat frozen, her hands curling into tiny fists in her lap. The sting of his words pressed against her chest like a heavy weight. She wanted to argue, to tell him that art wasn't just about fancy galleries and rich collectors, but her throat closed up, and all she could do was stare at her small pile of unsold paintings. Nearby, a group of wealthy tourists dressed in summer linens laughed and chatted, sipping on iced coffee, completely oblivious to the little girl sitting at the edge of the marketplace, trying her hardest not to cry. The sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the cobblestone streets. Emma felt her energy slipping away. The exhaustion of the day, of the week, of the whole year crashing down on her small frame. She had sold one painting, one, and while that meant the world to her, deep down she knew it wasn't enough. Her arms wrapped tightly around her chest, the chilly evening breeze making her shiver as she whispered to herself, maybe they're right, maybe I'm just a kid. She reached for her stuffed sea turtle, her constant source of comfort, and hugged it close, staring at the sky as the golden light faded into deep. Emma Sinclair sat up a little straighter, her small hands gripping the edge of her wooden stand as she gazed up at the mysterious man in the black trench coat and cowboy hat. He stood there in silence, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow over her tiny booth as the last rays of the setting sun painted the sky in fiery streaks of orange and pink. Unlike the others who had passed by, barely sparing her work a glance, this man seemed different. His piercing blue eyes scanned the paintings carefully, moving from one canvas to the next, his expression unreadable. He wasn't just looking. He was studying them. Emma's heart thumped loudly in her chest. She had been ignored, dismissed and pitied all day. But this man, whoever he was actually seeing her. Swallowing her nerves, Emma finally spoke, her voice small but steady. "Mister, do you like art?" The man smirked, his weathered face revealing deep lines of age and wisdom. His voice, when he spoke, was low and gravelly, like the kind of voice that had told 1,000 stories without ever needing to raise a single word. "Depends," he said, tilting his head slightly. "What's the story behind these?" Emma blinked. No one had asked her that before. People asked about prices, sizes, and colors, but never about the meaning. She glanced down at the painting he was staring at, a stormy sea beneath a midnight sky. It was one of her favorites, one she had painted on a particularly hard night in the hospital when she couldn't sleep, her mind swirling with fear. Taking a deep breath, she explained, "I like painting the ocean because it never stops moving. No matter how big the waves are, it keeps going." She hesitated, then added softly, "Kind of like me." The man's smirk faded, his expression shifting into something deeper, something almost understanding. For a long moment he said nothing, just staring at the painting as if it held a secret only he could unlock. Emma could feel her stomach twisting, unsure of what he was thinking. Then, without another word, he reached down, picked up the painting, and turned it over in his hands. "I'll take this one," he finally said. Emma brightened. She had sold another painting. She reached for the small notebook where she wrote down her sales, flipping to a fresh page. "Okay, that one's $250, she said, trying to sound professional, the way she had seen her mom do when counting tips at the diner. The man didn't pull out cash. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out something Emma hadn't seen in years, a checkbook. Her breath caught as she watched him uncap a pen, his movement slow and deliberate, as though every action carried the weight of something important. The tip of his pen scratched against the paper, filling out the check with steady, practiced strokes before he tore it from the book and handed it to her. Emma took it with small, careful hands, her fingers brushing against the crisp paper as she read the number printed in bold ink. Then her entire world tilted. Not $250, not $1,000, not $50,000, $100,000. Her vision blurred as she stared at the impossible number, her brain struggling to catch up. No, that couldn't be right. She must have read it wrong. Her lips parted slightly and she looked up at the man, her small hands shaking. "Mister, I think you made a mistake." The man chuckled softly, tipping his hat back just enough to reveal his sharp, legendary features beneath the glow of the streetlights. That's when Emma saw it, the unmistakable face she had seen in old movies playing on her uncle's TV late at night. Her breath hitched. "Clint Eastwood," she whispered. He gave her a slow nod, his smirk returning. "No mistake, kid." Emma's lips trembled, tears pooling in her wide blue eyes as the weight of what just happened settled into her small chest. $100,000. That was more than she could have made in a lifetime of painting. More than enough to pay for her treatment. More than enough to save her life. A gasp rippled through the crowd as people nearby finally recognized him. "Wait, is that Clint Eastwood?" someone shouted. A murmur turned into excitement, whispers becoming shouts as people scrambled to pull out their phones, snapping pictures of the legendary actor standing in front of a tiny art stand, handing over a check worth more than most people made in a year. Emma was frozen in place, her heart pounding, her mind spinning. This had to be a dream, a miracle, a movie. Things like this didn't happen in real life. She looked down at the check again, as if it might disappear if she blinked too long. $100,000. Clint Eastwood leaned down slightly, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "Just keep painting, kid." Emma swallowed hard, trying to find words, but all that came out was a soft, shaky whisper. "Thank you." He tipped his hat once more. The world around Emma Sinclair erupted into chaos. People who had barely given her a second glance earlier were now crowding around, their voices buzzing with disbelief and excitement. Some gasped, some pointed, and others fumbled for their phones, snapping pictures of the legendary Clint Eastwood standing in front of her tiny wooden art stand, the check already folded tightly in her trembling hands. The whispers turned into a full-blown frenzy. "Did he just buy a painting for $100,000? One woman shrieked, pressing her hand over her chest in shock. A teenage boy clutched his friend's arm. "Dude, that's Clint Eastwood. He just gave her $100,000. A businessman in a press suit, who had walked by earlier without a second glance, suddenly doubled back, eyes wide. "Unbelievable," he muttered, shaking his head. Emma, however, barely heard them. The world around her had become a blur of sound and movement, but she was stuck in a moment that felt like a dream. Her tiny hands trembled as she looked down at the check once more, her fingers gripping it tightly, afraid that if she let go, it might vanish like mist in the morning sun. $100,000. That was real. That was hers. That was enough to save her life. A sob built up in her chest, but she swallowed it down, her emotions tangled between overwhelming joy and utter disbelief. Her mother, Grace Sinclair, had been working the dinner shift at the local diner, completely unaware of the storm that had just hit her daughter's small world. But within minutes, her phone began blowing up with notifications, texts from coworkers, missed calls from her boss, and a frantic voicemail from Uncle Ray. "Grace, you need to get down here, right now. Something big just happened." Meanwhile, Emma remained frozen in place, still trying to process the reality of it all. But the world had already decided for her. Within minutes, her tiny art stand became the center of the entire marketplace. People who had ignored her all day were now scrambling to buy her work. Hands shot forward, waving cash and credit cards, voices overlapping as eager customers tried to claim a piece of her artwork. "I want that one," a woman shouted, pointing to a painting of a sunset over the ocean. "I'll take 2. Another man barked, waving a $100 bill. "Name your price," a well-dressed older gentleman declared, flipping open his wallet. Emma's heart pounded in her chest. Just an hour ago, she had been invisible, dismissed as just another kid with a sob story. Now everyone wanted a piece of her. It was thrilling, but also terrifying. She glanced down at her small collection of paintings, the same ones that had sat untouched for hours. Now, in a matter of minutes, they were vanishing one by one. It was Lisa Monroe, the local journalist, who pulled Emma from her daze. The young reporter, who had been quietly observing the scene unfold, knelt down beside Emma's stand, her notebook already open. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "how do you feel right now?" Emma swallowed hard, her voice shaky. I don't know," she admitted, her lips quivering. "I think this is the best day of my life." Lisa smiled warmly. "Can you tell me what you're going to do with the money?" For the first time since Clint Eastwood had walked away, Emma felt steady enough to breathe. She clutched the check to her chest, her blue eyes shining with something deeper than just excitement. "I'm going to help my mommy," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. And just like that, the story exploded beyond Charleston. By the time Grace arrived at the market, she found her daughter completely surrounded by customers, by journalists, by curious onlookers who wanted to witness the miracle firsthand. Gasping, she pushed through the crowd, her heart racing. "Emma?" she called, her voice tinged with panic. And then she saw it. She saw the check, the crowd, the flashes of cameras, and the way her daughter was clutching her stuffed sea turtle against her chest, her small shoulders trembling under the weight of a life-changing moment. Emma turned, and the second their eyes met, she ran straight into her mother's arms. "Mommy!" she sobbed, burying her face into her mother's shoulder. "Emma, baby, what is happening?" Grace stammered, gripping her daughter tightly, her hands cupping the back of her little head as though she was afraid to let go. Emma pulled back, her tear-streaked face breaking into a breathless smile. She held up the check with both hands, her voice small, yet full of wonder. "Mommy, we can pay for the medicine now." For a second, Grace couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe. Her hands shook as she took the check, staring at the number printed in bold black ink. She felt her knees nearly give out beneath her. $100,000? She whispered, barely able to comprehend it. Emma nodded eagerly, wiping her tears with the back of her sleeve. The sun had long disappeared beyond the horizon, leaving the Charleston marketplace bathed in the soft glow of street lights and the twinkle of distant city lights. Emma Sinclair sat curled up on her mother's lap, her tiny arms wrapped around Grace's waist, her cheek resting against the fabric of her mother's diner uniform. The crowd had thinned, though the excitement of what had transpired still buzzed through the air like the lingering hum of a passing storm. Uncle Ray stood nearby, his strong hands resting on the wooden crates that once held Emma's paintings, his eyes reflecting something between pride and disbelief. The little art stand, what had begun as a desperate attempt to scrape together money for treatment, was now the most talked about spot in Charleston. The last few hours had been a whirlwind, but now that things had settled, Grace held her daughter tightly, afraid to let go, as if the moment might slip away. She kept glancing at the check still gripped in her trembling hands, the reality of it sinking deeper with each passing second. $100,000, more money than she had ever seen, enough to pay for Emma's treatment, enough to save her life. A tear slipped down Grace's cheek, and she pressed a soft kiss to the top of Emma's head. "Baby," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We did it." Emma, exhausted from the night's events, nuzzled closer, her small fingers curling into the fabric of her mother's sleeve. "No, Mommy," she murmured sleepily. "Clint Eastwood did it." A soft chuckle rumbled through Uncle Ray's chest as he crossed his arms. "That cowboy sure has a way of making things happen," he mused, shaking his head. The next morning, the world knew Emma's name. It started with a viral news article, the headline plastered across every social media platform. Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood buys an 11-year-old's painting for $100,000. And you won't believe why. Within hours, Emma's story spread like wildfire. News stations, radio hosts, bloggers, and reporters flocked to the Sinclair family's tiny apartment, all eager to hear from the little girl whose life had changed overnight. Emma, still in her pajamas and clutching her stuffed sea turtle, peered out the window, watching as journalists stood outside their front door, microphones in hand. Grace was overwhelmed. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Calls came from all over the country, from art collectors, gallery owners, even a publishing house that wanted to turn Emma's story into a children's book. Donations poured in, letters from strangers arrived by the dozens, and people who had never met her were suddenly offering to help. But through it all, Emma remained the same. She still spent her mornings painting at the small kitchen table, her fingers dipping into swirls of bright blues and soft pinks, still creating oceans and skies that stretched far beyond the walls of their tiny home. She didn't care about the cameras or the headlines. She cared about the feeling she got when she painted. Free, strong, limitless. 1 week later, as Emma sat on the couch flipping through a scrapbook Uncle Ray had made of all the newspaper clippings, her mother walked in holding an envelope. A thick, cream-colored envelope with no return address. "Emma," Grace said softly, sitting beside her, "this just came for you." Emma sat up, setting the scrapbook aside. She took the envelope carefully, her fingers tracing the edges before she peeled it open. Inside there was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. When she opened it, she gasped. The handwriting was strong and steady, written in black ink. "Dear Emma, I have seen many stories in my lifetime, but yours is one worth telling. Never stop painting. The world needs your colors. Clint." Emma pressed the letter to her chest, her eyes glistening with fresh tears. She couldn't believe it. A letter from Clint Eastwood himself. She had thought the moment was over, that he had walked away, leaving nothing but a memory. But now he had given her something else, a reminder that she wasn't just a little girl selling paintings. She was an artist, a fighter, a storyteller. She jumped up, running into her mother's arms, her little heart bursting with happiness. "He wrote to me, Mommy," she squealed, holding up the letter like it was the most precious thing in the world. Grace wiped her tears and smiled. "Yes, baby. And now it's your turn to tell your story." And so, Emma did. A month later, her paintings were displayed in a prestigious Charleston gallery, featured in an exhibit called "The Girl Who Painted Hope." Orders for her work came from all over the world, and with the money she made, Emma not only paid for her treatment, but donated art supplies to hospitals for other kids like her. Her final chemotherapy session came and went. She was cancer-free. And through it all, she never stopped painting. Because one night, in a little market by the sea, a cowboy with a quiet smile and a heart of gold had given her more than just a check. He had given her a future. And Emma Sinclair was just getting started. Emma's story teaches us that kindness, resilience, and believing in yourself can change everything. Life is full of struggles, and sometimes it feels like no one notices your hard work or the battles you're fighting. But just because success doesn't come right away doesn't mean you're not on the right path. Keep going, even when it's hard. The right people will see you when the time is right. Clint Eastwood didn't help Emma because she begged for it. He saw her fighting for herself, chasing her dream despite the odds. That's a lesson for all of us. Opportunities don't always come knocking. Sometimes you have to build your own door. No matter where you are in life, keep creating, keep believing, and keep pushing forward. The world needs your story, your talent, and your determination. You never know who's watching and ready to change your life.